On the afternoon of May 29, 1993, 32-year-old Norma Rodriguez stood over a grill flipping hamburgers in her backyard in Port Hueneme, California. Norma had long brown wavy hair, and she was wearing a light colorful dress. It was Memorial Day weekend, and Norma had invited over a bunch of her friends and coworkers from the retail store where she worked to celebrate the holiday. Music was playing, the smell of food wafted through the backyard, and the weather felt perfect at about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Norma smiled as she watched her youngest son, who was 4 years old, running around the yard with a few of her friends' kids, and she thought to herself that she couldn't have asked for a better day to host a party. Norma checked the burgers on the grill and then shouted out to the guests that the food was ready. Then she put the burgers on a tray and put it down on a long picnic table next to paper plates, side dishes, and condiments that she'd already laid out. Then she just stepped back and watched as her friends continued talking, laughing, and walking over to the table to get their food. And as she watched them, she was reminded of all the family cookouts she had had when she was a kid. Norma came from a big family. She had 6 sisters and a brother, and she still enjoyed having her house filled with people. A friend of Norma's, Warren Mackey, walked over to her with his plate of food in his hand. He thanked Norma for the burger and for inviting him to the party. Warren and Norma had worked together for a while, but even after Warren had left the job, they stayed in touch, because Norma was one of those people who made friends for life. In fact, she was still close with people she'd known in college and in high school, and she made it a point to still talk to them as often as she could. Warren took a bite of his hamburger, and then he told Norma that he'd noticed the rim on the basketball hoop in her driveway was bent forward, and he said he'd be happy to fix it right now if Norma wanted him to, and Norma said that would be great. She knew her oldest son would be very excited when he got home and he saw the basketball hoop that he loved was now fixed. Norma lived in a small one-story house in Port Hueneme with her 4-year-old and 11-year-old boys. She had met the boys' father, Anthony Rodriguez, when she was in college, and they had married a couple of years later and started their family. Norma and Anthony's relationship had looked perfect from the outside. They seemed happy together, and they had these 2 beautiful sons. But despite the appearance of how they looked, internally, their relationship was kind of a mess. Anthony spent a ton of time away from the house, either working or just hanging out with his brother, so Norma had often felt like she and the boys were just not a priority for Anthony. And the longer they had stayed together, the worse their relationship got, and soon they were fighting all the time. And so, 2 years before this Memorial Day party, Norma had finally had enough, and she had divorced Anthony. As a single mom, Norma spent all of her time making sure she was providing for and taking care of her sons. She put in long hours at the retail store where she worked to earn extra money, but she also tried really hard to spend as much time as she could with the boys. She made it a point to help her oldest with his homework, and she always tried to be home to make the boys dinner and to help her youngest get ready for bed every night. It wasn't easy, but Norma never worried about how busy or tired she was. As long as her sons were okay, she was too. Norma also tried to remain friends with her ex-husband, Anthony, really just for her son's sake. She'd even let her oldest son miss the backyard cookout that day just so he could go to a baseball game with his dad and his uncle. And so for the most part, Norma was happy on her own with her kids. But there were times, like when her son's basketball hoop broke, that she missed having someone else in her life to help her manage everything. But the few times she dated since the divorce had not led to anything long-term, and Norma was just really picky about who she let into her and her son's lives. And so she was appreciative of friends like Warren who would pitch in and help her from time to time. After Warren had very quickly fixed the basketball hoop, Norma had thanked him profusely, and then she walked over to talk to one of her other friends named Beatrice. The 2 women had met at work, and they had hit it off right away. Beatrice was having problems in her marriage, and so she felt like Norma was one of the only people she could actually talk to about it because of Norma's experience with her own divorce. Norma asked Beatrice if she was doing okay, and Beatrice would say that, things are about the same, and then Beatrice would ask Norma how she was doing, and Norma would say that, life was great, except that lately her ex-husband, Anthony, had started showing up at their house totally unannounced. Norma didn't mind letting her oldest son spend more time with Anthony than Anthony was actually allotted in their custody agreement to go see a baseball game or to spend an extra weekend with him, but Norma was not okay with Anthony coming to the house whenever he wanted, like he still lived there. Beatrice asked Norma if Anthony had tried to sleep with her again, like maybe he wanted to rekindle things. But Norma said no, he usually just came into the house, talked for a minute, and then sat down on the couch and watched TV. and if Norma tried to ask him to leave, he would just get mad. One of Norma's sisters, who lived nearby, had told her to just stop letting Anthony into the house at all, and Beatrice said she agreed with Norma's sister. Norma had to draw boundaries. But Norma worried that keeping Anthony out of the house would upset the boys, and that was the last thing she wanted. She knew her sons loved their dad, especially her oldest son, who shared a lot of interests with Anthony. And so her oldest son liked to hang out with his dad and talk about baseball and basketball and other things that Norma just didn't really know much about. Beatrice and Norma talked a bit longer about the whole situation, and then Norma walked around the backyard and checked in with her other guests to see if they needed anything. Norma's Memorial Day cookout lasted for hours. Some people stuck around until long after the sun had set to spend some more time with Norma and to help her clean up. Eventually, when the last guest had left, Norma picked up her 4-year-old son, who was still running around outside, and she began carrying him towards the house. Before she went inside, she turned and looked over at the now fixed basketball hoop and smiled, thinking about how nice it was that Warren had done that. Norma went inside and made her way to her son's room, where she tucked him into his bed and said goodnight. Then she walked into her own bedroom and got changed into a t-shirt and a pair of comfortable shorts. She went to the living room at the front of the house and then sat down on the couch to watch TV. On most nights, Norma found it a lot easier to fall asleep on the couch watching TV than she did falling asleep in her own bed, and this night was no different. A few minutes after finding something to watch, Norma felt her eyes getting heavy, and so she stretched out on the couch, and with the sound of the TV playing in the background, she drifted off to sleep. 24 hours later, at about 10:30 p.m. on May 30th, Norma walked down the hall towards her 4-year-old son's bedroom. She opened the door quietly, looked in, and saw him sound asleep in his bed. Norma knew he was still totally worn out from the barbecue the day before. Norma had spent that day cleaning up the house a bit and watching movies with her 4-year-old. Her oldest son was still staying with her ex-husband Anthony, and he wouldn't be home until the following night. So the house felt quiet and a little empty. Eventually, Norma went to the living room, turned on the TV, and stretched out on the couch like she had done the night before, and within a few minutes, she had drifted off to sleep. The next day, at 9:45 p.m. on May 31st, so 48 hours after the barbecue, Norma's 11-year-old son stepped out of Anthony's car in front of the house. The boy said goodbye to his father and to his uncle, who was also in the car. Then he walked up to the front door of the house as they drove away. The boy grabbed the doorknob, but the door was locked. So he knocked on the door and waited, but nobody answered. Then he knocked again, but there still was no answer. The boy figured his mom had just fallen asleep on the couch like she usually did, and so he looked out to the street to see if maybe his dad was still nearby and could help him wake up his mom. But his dad was gone. So the boy walked around to the side of the house to his open bedroom window. Norma liked to keep the windows open when it was nice out in the summer. The boy leaned in close to the window and pulled off the screen and put it on the ground. Then he grabbed the actual window and raised it higher and then climbed inside. But when he got into his room, he almost screamed. He was startled because his 4-year-old younger brother was just sitting there in the middle of his room. The 11-year-old caught his breath and then asked his little brother why he wasn't in his bed. The 4-year-old just looked at him and then pointed at the door leading into the bedroom and said, "Mommy has a Band-Aid on her face." The 11-year-old looked at his little brother for a second, totally confused, but then he figured his little brother was just tired and not making any sense, or that his mom maybe had cut her cheek or something and had put a Band-Aid on the cut. Either way, the 11-year-old didn't want to wake up his mom if she was sleeping, so he walked his little brother to his own room and tucked him in. Then the 11-year-old went back to his room, changed into pajamas, and went to bed as well. The following morning, so June 1st, at around 7:30 a.m., Norma's ex-husband, Anthony, pulled his car up in front of their house again. Anthony and his brother got out of the car and walked up to the front door. Anthony was 33 years old, and he was tall with dark hair and dark eyes. He knocked on the door, and then he and his brother stood on the porch and talked while they waited for Norma to answer. Anthony and his brother were there to take the boys for the day because Norma had made plans to go to the beach with some of her friends. After a few moments had passed and Norma had not come to the door, Anthony knocked again. And when nobody answered again, he said he was worried something weird was going on. Norma knew he was coming over, and even when she fell asleep on the couch, she always woke up early in the morning. Anthony pounded on the door again, and again when nobody answered, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and then grabbed a credit card that was inside of it. Then he slipped the credit card into the crack between the door and the frame right under the lock. He shook the card up and down against the lock a few times, and then just like that, the lock gave way. As soon as this happened, Anthony looked back at his brother with a smile on his face, and his brother clearly was impressed that Anthony was able to do that. Anthony then opened the door and walked into the living room, and he was about to call out to Norma, but then he saw something and just froze. Then Anthony turned back to his brother and yelled for him to give him the knife that Anthony knew his brother always carried. His brother grabbed the knife out of his pocket and handed it over. Anthony took the knife and ran across the living room and got down on the floor. And his brother saw him cutting something with the knife, but he couldn't see exactly what was going on. Then, just as quickly as Anthony had done that, he stood up and ran into the kitchen and called 911. A few minutes after Anthony called 911, Detective Tony Paradise walked through the small Port Hueneme Police Department, drinking a fresh cup of coffee. His phone was ringing at his desk, so he sat down and answered it. On the other line, a 911 dispatcher said they'd just gotten a call about a potential homicide. Paradise hung up the phone, and he thought somebody was playing a prank on him. That day was literally Paradise's first day on the job. He just transferred over from a station in Los Angeles, and he knew that Port Hueneme had a very low crime rate and that the small local police force had not dealt with a reported homicide case in close to 3 years. So Paradise thought the phone call might just be the other cops kind of hazing the new guy. Paradise got up and walked over to the desk of lead detective Dennis Fitzgerald to see if he was really being pranked. But Fitzgerald said there was no way that call was a joke. So Fitzgerald, Paradise, and several other officers headed outside, got into their cars, and drove a few minutes across town to Norma's house. Paradise parked his car in front of the house behind Fitzgerald's and then stepped outside. Paramedics were already there, and a uniformed officer was standing outside with Anthony, his brother, and Norma's 2 young sons. And Paradise saw at least a few of Norma's neighbors standing on their porches trying to see what was going on. Paradise still couldn't believe this was how he was spending his first day as a Port Hueneme detective. He thought Port Hueneme was the type of place people moved to so they could feel safe, a place where they could escape to the beach and leave their windows open at night without worrying about anything. Detective Fitzgerald waved Paradise over. Fitzgerald was 49 years old. He was average height, and he had thinning hair and a mustache. The detectives headed up the walkway towards the front door, while other officers started to block off the scene with police tape. The front door was open, so Paradise and Fitzgerald just walked right into the living room and put on their gloves. Then both detectives walked across the room towards the kitchen, and when they saw what was on the floor, they felt like they'd walked into a scene from a horror movie. A woman's dead body was lying there. It was Norma, and her face and head were completely wrapped in duct tape. Fitzgerald and Paradise crouched down to get a closer look at the victim. A small piece of the duct tape had been cut away from her nose and mouth, and there was a set of house keys lying on the floor next to her. The detectives also noticed that rigor mortis had already started to set in, which causes the body to stiffen after death. But inside of a controlled environment, like this suburban living room, rigor mortis usually takes several hours to appear in the arms and legs. So Fitzgerald and Paradise believed the victim had most likely been dead in the house since sometime the day before. Fitzgerald and Paradise stood up and searched the living room. There was no blood anywhere, no weapon, and no sign of forced entry. So Fitzgerald wondered if maybe Norma had come home with the killer and still had her keys in her hand when she was attacked. While the detectives did a full search of the house, the forensics team arrived. They started to take DNA samples from Norma's body, using sweat from her hands, fingernail clippings, and samples from the duct tape wrapped around her head. In 1993, DNA testing was still a relatively new investigative technique. Large samples of DNA were required to get any useful results, and the testing process took a really long time. So investigators knew they should not expect a fast turnaround with any of these samples. During their search of the house, Fitzgerald and Paradise didn't find anything that had been disturbed in either of the boys' bedrooms or in Norma's bedroom. So they walked back outside and pulled Anthony down the walkway to talk to him, while Norma's sons stayed with their uncle and another officer. Anthony confirmed that the dead woman inside the house was his ex-wife, Norma Rodriguez. And Fitzgerald told Anthony they would need him and his brother to come to the station to answer some questions. Anthony said he understood and then walked back over to his sons. A little later, as Fitzgerald drove away from the house back to the station, he couldn't get the image of Norma out of his mind. There was something about wrapping duct tape around her face and head that felt so personal and invasive to Fitzgerald. So he was convinced whoever had done it must have known Norma intimately, and Fitzgerald thought that all of the initial signs pointed to Norma's ex-husband, Anthony. Shortly after Detective Fitzgerald went back to the Port Hueneme police station, he sat down with Anthony inside of an interrogation room. The room was bright, cold, and cramped, and Anthony knew that Fitzgerald did not just want to have a casual conversation with him. Anthony was sure the police had targeted him as a suspect from the moment they showed up at the house. After all, he was the ex-husband, and he was the one who had found Norma's body. Anthony's brother had also been brought to the station for questioning, and Norma's sons were there too. Fitzgerald needed to talk to the boys, but he knew they were scared and still in shock, so he wanted to make sure they were physically and mentally okay before he talked to them about what had happened to their mother. In the interrogation room, Fitzgerald asked Anthony to start by explaining what had happened earlier that morning when Anthony had arrived at his ex-wife's house. And Anthony told Fitzgerald how when nobody had answered the door, he had unlocked it using a credit card. Fitzgerald sat straight up in his chair. This was a huge red flag, and Fitzgerald had a couple of different thoughts running through his head. Did this guy have experience breaking into houses? Or had Anthony just used the key to get in, and he was making up the credit card story to cover his tracks? The police had found a set of house keys next to Norma's body on the floor, and there was no sign of forced entry. So Fitzgerald believed there was a good chance whoever killed Norma had been invited into the house, and he knew Anthony was a frequent visitor there. Anthony could have easily killed Norma, taken the keys, used them to get back into the house the following day, and then put the keys on the floor by Norma's body before the police arrived. But Fitzgerald didn't want to show his hand in any way, so he let Anthony keep talking. And Fitzgerald spotted yet another huge red flag almost immediately. Anthony said when he walked into the house, he saw Norma lying on the floor between the living room and the kitchen, and her head and face were completely wrapped in duct tape. And so he said his first instinct was to cut the tape away so Norma could breathe. So Anthony got a utility knife from his brother that had a fold-out pair of scissors on it, and he had rushed over to Norma and cut the duct tape away from her mouth and nose. He said her body still felt warm when he was touching her, but she wasn't breathing, so he ran into the kitchen and called 911. Fitzgerald leaned back and just kind of stared at Anthony in disbelief. In Fitzgerald's mind, Anthony was admitting to tampering with evidence at a murder scene. And the idea that Anthony thought Norma's body was still warm didn't seem possible to Fitzgerald. He knew Norma had been dead since the day before Anthony and his brother showed up at the house, so her body definitely would not have been warm. It would have been cold. But Fitzgerald knew that people could experience different things and make strange decisions when they were in shock. So even though everything about Anthony's story felt totally off to Fitzgerald, he stayed open to the idea that Anthony could be telling the truth. Fitzgerald asked Anthony if he would stay at the station and submit to a polygraph, which is commonly known as a lie detector test. Anthony said he would, and he also agreed to submit DNA samples for testing. While Anthony was prepped for his polygraph, Fitzgerald stepped out of the interrogation room and met with the investigators who had been speaking with Anthony's brother. And it would turn out both men had given identical stories of what had happened. But that didn't really mean anything to Fitzgerald. Anthony and his brother could have easily worked out a story together before they called 911. Later that day, Norma's ex-husband Anthony sat through a polygraph test and he passed. So as far as that test was concerned, Anthony was telling the truth about the events of the morning, which meant he was telling the truth about not killing Norma. Not long after Anthony had taken his polygraph, Fitzgerald and Paradise walked into an office in the police station where Norma's sons had been waiting with an officer and a child welfare social worker. Fitzgerald crouched down in front of the chair where Norma's 4-year-old son was sitting, and he introduced himself in a soft, calm voice. The little boy was scared and confused, and he barely spoke. So his 11-year-old brother stepped in to try to help police as best as he could. He told detectives about how his dad and uncle had dropped him off at home the night before and how he had missed the Memorial Day cookout at the house. Then the 11-year-old told them that, the front door was locked when he got home, and so he'd gone in through his bedroom window, and that was when he found his little brother just sitting there in the middle of the room. He said he didn't want to wake up his mom, so he tucked his younger brother into bed and then went back to his own room and fell asleep. But then the 11-year-old remembered something else. He told police that when he first climbed into his bedroom, his little brother had said something really weird. He said, "Mommy has a Band-Aid on her face." At that moment, something hit Fitzgerald and Paradise for the first time. They realized that Norma's 4-year-old son had been alone in the house with the body of his dead mother for hours, and the little boy couldn't understand what the duct tape covering his mother's face was, so he had told his older brother that their mom had a Band-Aid on her face. Fitzgerald and Paradise tried not to react in front of the boys, but nothing they had seen in their time as cops had ever hit them as hard as that image of this poor little boy just alone with his dead mother, not having any idea what had happened. Fitzgerald thanked both of the boys for talking to them, and he told them that the police were there to help them if they needed anything. Then he and Paradise walked out of the office, and Fitzgerald sat down at his desk and tried to collect himself. He had kids of his own, and he struggled to imagine how anyone their age or younger could go through what Norma's little boy had gone through. On June 2nd, so the day after Norma's body had been discovered, Fitzgerald and Paradise got Norma's autopsy results, and those results caused them to fixate on the duct tape even more. It turned out the killer had used 20 feet of duct tape to completely cover Norma's face and head. The detectives were stunned by the amount of time that must have taken. And their initial thought after seeing the autopsy results was that whoever had killed Norma had immediately wanted to kind of distance themselves from her. So they had used the tape to depersonalize her and make her someone kind of faceless. This theory supported Fitzgerald's first impression that the killer must have known Norma well, and so after the murder, they couldn't admit to themselves that they had killed someone so close to them. But Norma's ex-husband, Anthony, who really seemed like the best suspect, had passed his polygraph. That didn't mean the police would rule him out as a suspect, but they needed to meet with other people who were also close to Norma. And they wanted to start by focusing on Norma's friends who had recently been at her house for that cookout. In the week following Norma's murder, the investigative team tracked down everyone who had attended Norma's Memorial Day cookout the day before she was murdered. And one of the first people they brought into the station to talk to was Warren Mackey, Norma's former coworker who had fixed the basketball hoop in the driveway. Warren was very tall and thin, with short brown hair and a mustache, and on this day he was wearing a t-shirt and jeans. Warren told Fitzgerald and Paradise that he and Norma had kept in touch even after he had stopped working at the same retail store as her. He said Norma was one of the nicest people he'd ever met, and that she always treated everyone around her like family. And so that was why so many people stayed close to her even after they moved away or they didn't work together anymore. Then Warren talked about the actual Memorial Day barbecue and said while he was there, he had fixed the basketball hoop, and then at the end of the party, he had stayed back with a few people to help Norma clean up, and then he had just gone home, and that was it. Fitzgerald nodded and then asked Warren where he'd been the following night, the night that Norma was actually murdered. Warren shifted a bit in his seat and his face began to turn red. He said he was embarrassed, but he'd gone out to a club that night with some friends, and he'd gotten really drunk and done a little cocaine. A look of surprise came across Fitzgerald's face, not at what Warren had done at the club, but that he was admitting to using hard drugs in front of a police officer. But Fitzgerald wasn't investigating cocaine use, so he asked Warren if he would take a polygraph and submit DNA samples. And Warren quickly agreed and immediately sat for the polygraph. He passed the test just like Anthony had, and later that day, when Fitzgerald and Paradise followed up with the friends Warren said he'd gone to the club with, they corroborated his alibi. The investigation was only in its first week, but Fitzgerald was starting to worry they were already totally off track. They had no evidence tying anybody they'd interviewed to the crime scene, and everyone who had taken a polygraph test had passed. So after the initial rush of the investigation, things started to slow down. Weeks went by and no new information or new leads came in, and Fitzgerald and Paradise, they kept digging, but nothing was panning out. Then, several weeks into the investigation, Fitzgerald got bad news from the forensics team. They had not been able to secure large enough DNA samples from the crime scene to effectively try to match it with DNA samples taken from Anthony and from Norma's friends who had gone to the cookout. So, without those DNA tests providing any help, Fitzgerald and Paradise scrambled to find a new way forward in this investigation. And then, a month after Norma's murder, they finally caught a break. One of Norma's sisters told Fitzgerald that she had found out a woman named Beatrice, who had been at that Memorial Day barbecue, was cheating on her husband. And Norma had given Beatrice an extra set of keys to her own house so Beatrice could meet this secret lover at Norma's house. The news that Norma's friend Beatrice was using Norma's house to carry out an affair got the murder investigation right back on track. And Fitzgerald wondered if maybe the keys that had been found on the floor next to Norma's body were the keys that Norma had given Beatrice. Fitzgerald had met with Beatrice early in the investigation when he was interviewing everybody who had been at Norma's cookout, but she hadn't said anything about an affair or the extra set of house keys. So when Fitzgerald met with Beatrice again at the station, he started his line of questioning by asking her why she had kept that information from police. Beatrice looked at Fitzgerald and her face turned red and her eyes started to water. She said she was totally ashamed and embarrassed that she was cheating on her husband, and she was scared what would happen if her husband found out. After speaking to Beatrice for several more hours, Fitzgerald did not think she was the killer. But he thought Beatrice's husband could be the person they were looking for. Fitzgerald thought that Beatrice's husband probably did know that his wife was cheating on him. And so he could have potentially stolen Beatrice's extra set of keys to Norma's house and used them to storm into Norma's house to confront Norma about her role in his wife's affair, and maybe in a fit of rage, he had killed Norma. So after meeting with Beatrice, Fitzgerald sent officers to bring in Beatrice's husband. The man looked totally confused from the second he walked into the police station. He said he didn't know Norma that well, and he really didn't understand how he could possibly help. But Fitzgerald led him into the interrogation room and took a seat across from him, and then just point blank, Fitzgerald asked if he had gone to Norma's house to confront her because she was letting Beatrice use the house to have an affair. A look of complete shock came across Beatrice's husband's face. He stared at Fitzgerald and then said he had no idea his wife had been cheating on him. By the time the interview ended, Fitzgerald felt really bad. He figured the man deserved to know the truth about his wife, but no one should have to find out like that. And if Beatrice's husband had been faking his reaction to this news, Fitzgerald figured he had to be the best actor in the entire world, because the guy walked out of the police station looking like his entire life had just come crashing down. And so, after Beatrice and her husband could not be directly linked to Norma's murder, the investigation slowed down again. And after months, nobody close to Norma had failed a polygraph. There was still no help from any of the DNA tests. There was no concrete evidence that pointed to anybody in particular, and so the case just started to go cold. No matter how hard Fitzgerald and Paradise worked to move the investigation forward, they felt like they didn't have anywhere to go, and several more months passed with no new details coming in. People in the small city of Port Hueneme started to get restless, and wild theories surfaced that Norma's murder was the work of a serial killer who staged his victims in dramatic ways. But that wild theory, or any other wild theory, never checked out. And then 1 year passed after another, and Norma Rodriguez's murder started to fade from the media and from public discussion, and soon the police turned to other cases. But Detective Fitzgerald vowed he would keep working the case until Norma's killer was brought to justice. Fitzgerald had been almost 50 years old at the time of Norma's murder, and he promised Norma's sisters that he would not retire until the case was solved, no matter how old he got. So, by the time Fitzgerald was almost 60 years old, he was still working the case and trying to keep his promise to Norma's sisters. Flash forward to May 31st, 2003, 10 years to the day after Norma's murder, and Fitzgerald was sitting in his office at the Port Hueneme police station. Years earlier, he had put a photo of Norma on his desk to remind him of the promise he'd made to her sisters, and also to help people remember that there was a real person whose life had been taken and who still deserved justice. Fitzgerald's phone suddenly rang, and so he answered it, and on the other line, someone from the state crime lab told Fitzgerald that they had news about the Norma Rodriguez case that he might not believe. Fitzgerald held his breath and listened. He learned that the crime lab had been following up on all these cold cases, and in doing that, they believed they had finally learned who had killed Norma. In the 10 years since Norma's murder, there had been major advances in DNA testing. So, in 2003, the DNA samples that had been taken from Norma's body were now, with all these advances, more than enough to find a match. The crime lab said they still needed to run new tests on the duct tape that was found on Norma to confirm their suspicions about her killer, but they would have those results soon. Fitzgerald hung up the phone and he wanted to cry. He had lived with Norma's case for a decade, and even he had started to doubt that he would ever be able to solve it. But just a few weeks after Fitzgerald got that big phone call, the crime lab confirmed their initial findings. So Fitzgerald picked up the phone and called one of Norma's sisters to let her know that Norma would finally be able to rest in peace, because he finally knew what had happened to her and who had done it. Based on DNA test results, evidence found at the scene, and interviews conducted throughout the 10-year investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened on May 31st, 1993, the day Norma Rodriguez was murdered. Just after midnight, the killer parked their car down the street from Norma's house. They picked up a roll of duct tape off the passenger seat and then stepped outside of their car into the dark summer night. The killer quickly scanned the nearby houses to make sure nobody was outside. When the killer was sure the area was clear, they moved quickly down the street, staying in the shadows and away from the streetlights. The killer was feeling angry and hurt and embarrassed, and they did not want to feel that way anymore. The killer crouched down low and moved quickly up the walkway to Norma's front door. They reached into their pocket, grabbed Norma's house keys, and unlocked the door and walked inside. The sound of laughter startled the killer, but they realized it was just coming from the TV, and they breathed a bit easier. The killer closed the front door behind them, put the keys back in their pocket, and walked into the living room. The sound from the TV got louder as they approached, and the killer saw Norma fast asleep on the couch. The killer stood there just for a second, watching her. Then they walked towards the couch and knelt down and put the duct tape on the floor. Then they lunged at Norma on the couch. Before Norma could even wake up, the killer had wrapped their hands around her throat and had begun strangling her. Norma's eyes opened wide and she gasped for breath. She flung her hands at the killer and tried to push them off. In the struggle, the killer kind of stumbled and Norma managed to fall off the couch onto the floor. She could barely breathe, but she tried to make it out of the living room to the kitchen. But the killer followed, grabbed her, and threw her on her back. Then the killer grabbed Norma's throat with both hands again and squeezed as hard as they could. Norma gasped and choked, and then her body stopped moving and she went limp. The killer finally released their grip, and they looked down and saw very clearly Norma was dead. The killer then went back through the living room, grabbed the duct tape off the floor, and then returned to Norma's body. Then the killer unrolled a piece of tape, covered Norma's eyes with it, and then wrapped it around the rest of her head. But the killer didn't stop. They held Norma's head up and wrapped 20 feet of duct tape around her face and head 14 times. Finally, the killer ripped off the tape from the roll and let Norma's head fall to the floor. They reached into their pocket with their free hand, pulled out the house keys, and dropped them next to Norma's body. Then they ran back through the living room and opened the front door. They locked the door handle from the inside, then walked out of the house, closed the locked door behind them, and ran down the walkway with the roll of duct tape still in their hand. The same duct tape they had used to help prop up the rim on the basketball hoop in Norma's driveway. Warren Mackey, Norma's former co-worker who had been at the Memorial Day cookout, had murdered Norma. It would turn out that Warren had wanted to be more than just friends with Norma, and for a while, he thought that was a real possibility. Norma and Warren talked on the phone regularly, and he even spent time at her house with her and the kids. But Norma just did not want a romantic relationship with Warren, and every time he asked her out or made a move on her at her house, she turned him down. Finally, Warren decided he just couldn't handle the rejection or the embarrassment he felt, so he decided he would murder Norma. At the Memorial Day cookout, while Norma walked around talking to her guests, Warren had gone into the house, found Norma's purse, and stolen her keys. It would turn out Norma had actually complained to a friend at the cookout that she had apparently misplaced her house keys somewhere. Then, late the following night, Warren had returned to Norma's house. He knew she slept on the couch a lot, so he figured he would either find her there or in her bedroom. It's not known if Warren had always intended to use the duct tape to wrap up Norma's face, or if he had decided to do it just because after he had killed her, he couldn't stand looking at her face and kind of seeing what he had done, and so he had just kind of impulsively decided to wrap her up. Following the murder, Warren had quickly gone home and then headed out late that night to the club with his friends to give himself a possible alibi. But the duct tape found on Norma ultimately discredited that alibi and led authorities to Warren after the investigation had stalled for 10 years. In 2003, the crime lab discovered that DNA samples that had been taken from Norma's hands matched the samples provided by Warren when he had submitted to DNA testing. But the crime lab and the district attorney believed it could be argued that Warren's DNA was found on Norma's hands because they had recently spent time together at a party. So tests were run on the part of the duct tape that had been torn away from the rest of the roll, the part of the duct tape that only the killer would have touched. And when DNA samples from the duct tape matched Warren's DNA, authorities knew they had found Norma's killer. Some investigators came to believe that Warren was able to pass his polygraph test because he possessed certain traits often linked to narcissists and sociopaths, things like a lack of remorse about lying and the ability to create a totally alternate reality in your mind that actually feels like the truth when you're talking about it. And so those traits can obviously make it easier for some people to pass a lie detector test even though they're lying. But regardless of how he passed that polygraph, Warren could not outrun the DNA evidence forever, and once the duct tape test confirmed he was the killer, police arrested him for Norma's murder. When Warren was confronted with the DNA evidence, he pled guilty to second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. As of fall of 2023, he is still in prison in California. At Warren's sentencing, one of Norma's sisters looked him in the eye and told him, quote, "I curse you for the rest of your life. You didn't just do this to my sister. You murdered all of us." End quote. At 5:30 p.m. on November 21st, 2016, Jodi Santoro, who was a 21-year-old mother in Melbourne, Australia, woke up to the sound of her 4-month-old son crying. Outside, there was this horrible thunderstorm going on. All this rain and hail were pelting the roof, and the wind was so strong that all the windows in the house were rattling. Jodi reached over and grabbed her phone on the nightstand and checked the time, and she saw right away that she had overslept. However, it had been a really hot day that day, and she was so drained from the heat and also taking care of a 4-month-old that she wasn't really surprised she had overslept. But as the sound of her son's cries intensified, Jodi knew, no matter how tired she was, she needed to get up and go tend to him. But the instant her legs swung off the bed and she actually tried to stand up, she knew something was wrong, and it had nothing to do with being tired. She had this incredible sense of dizziness come over her, and then her chest suddenly tightened up to the point where she could barely even breathe in. She found herself grabbing the bed just to steady herself. However, as alarming as this was, Jodi didn't panic. She knew this feeling. She had been dealing with asthma for years, and she knew this was the start of an asthma attack. And so Jodi reached over for her inhaler on the nightstand. She picked it up, brought it to her lips, pressed it down, and then took in a measured breath of the medication, expecting to pretty much immediately feel relief. But she didn't. The inhaler wasn't working. Jody again pressed down the inhaler harder this time and took a bigger breath in, hoping that a bit more medication might do the trick, but again, it just was not working. And so now with panic rising inside of her as she's, still struggling to breathe, her son is still freaking out and she can't tend to him, and all she was thinking is, I have to get my nebulizer, which is basically a more robust version of an inhaler. It provides more medication more quickly into your body. However, the nebulizer, which was just over in her closet, required some setup. And she knew she felt so frantic right now and she was shaking so much that she didn't think she'd be able to set it up or even set it up in time before she passed out. Just then, her fiancé walked into the bedroom, drawn there by the sound of their son crying. But the second he walked in, his attention was not on their son, it was instead on Jody, who by now was clutching the bed and kind of hobbled over and very clearly having some sort of medical emergency. Jody turned to him and began to say, I can't breathe. But her fiancé already knew she had asthma. He knew what these attacks looked like. And so without even needing to be told, he rushed to the closet, set up her nebulizer, and then put the mask right over her face. And as soon as it was, Jody took in the biggest inhale she possibly could, really believing this was going to stop the asthma attack. But just like the inhaler, the nebulizer didn't work. It felt like with every breath she was taking, her lungs were shrinking, not expanding. And so Jody turned to her fiancé and croaked out, call an ambulance, her voice barely audible. And so her fiancé, who also was now beginning to panic, grabbed the phone, and as he was talking to the dispatcher, trying to relay all the details of what was happening, outside this thunderstorm was only getting worse and worse. The hail and the rain were battering the sides of the house and all the windows were shaking. I mean, it was absolute bedlam inside of this house. The next few minutes were torture for Jody. She laid on the bed waiting for paramedics. Her breaths at this point were so small, so shallow, like she knew she was about to pass out any second. And then finally the paramedics rushed inside. She knew there were 2 people in the room, but it was so chaotic. And all she could say when they showed up in the room was, I'm going to die, I'm going to die. The paramedics lifted her off the bed, they put her on the gurney, and as they wheeled her out the door towards the ambulance, her world went totally black. The paramedics rushed Jody to Sunshine Hospital, and on the way, they tried to stabilize her by squeezing these oxygen bags, forcing oxygen into Jody's lungs. And as they were doing that, Jody's fiancé was following the ambulance right behind, white-knuckling the steering wheel, praying his fiancé was going to survive this asthma attack. When the ambulance finally arrived at Sunshine Hospital, the emergency room was mayhem. Paramedics quickly wheeled Jody in on her gurney, shouting out her vital signs to the doctors waiting near the door. Her fiancé, meanwhile, watched helplessly as the medical staff surrounded her and inserted IV lines, hooked up monitors, and began intubating her to force even more oxygen into her lungs. But fortunately, this rapid medical intervention, once Jody got to the hospital, appeared to work. Because not long after getting there, Jody did begin to stabilize, not enough to suggest that she was actually all better, but her condition basically began to improve. However, the moment she began to improve, instead of the medical team, talking to her and figuring out what happened and making sure she really was on a path to recovery here, instead, the medical team literally ran out of her room back out to the front of the ER because by this point, the Sunshine Hospital ER was overflowing with patients. There were all these people in the waiting room and also outside, and basically everybody had the same symptoms as Jody. They couldn't breathe. There were people slumped on the ground against the wall, screaming for help. I mean, the medical team was totally overwhelmed. And on top of that, there were ambulances literally lined up around the block waiting to drop off patients. There just wasn't any more space. But nonetheless, doctors and nurses and the medical team at the hospital worked furiously, moving from one patient to the next, sometimes in an exam room, sometimes out in the waiting room, sometimes outside. It's wherever the patients were. But the weird thing is all these people, they had the same symptoms, these severe asthma attacks, yet many of the people that were showing up had never had asthma in their lives before. So how was this happening? This went on for hours and hours. And really, the situation in the hospital only continued to get worse, with more and more and more patients showing up with worse and worse symptoms. And so during this madness, Jody, who really hadn't gotten better, she just stabilized, she actually was moved out of the emergency room and over to the ICU, pretty much just to create one more space for new patients.
And so in the ICU, Jody's fiance sat next to her, gripping her hand, listening to the sound of the monitors beeping steadily all around her. Outside the room, he could see doctors and nurses and medical staff sprinting up and down the hallways, looking frantic and worried. He had no idea what was happening here. He just hoped Jody would be okay. But it would turn out there actually was someone who knew exactly what was going on. A university researcher named Philip Taylor had actually predicted this the day before. Professor Taylor was an expert in atmospheric allergens, a field so niche that barely anybody outside of his small research circle had even heard of it. And so on the afternoon of November 20th, the day before, Taylor had been at home in his office analyzing data when he noticed something very alarming. All of the ingredients for a catastrophic event were aligning in the forecast, and the patterns were so precise that it stopped him cold. Taylor was stunned. He'd spent years studying the effects of weather on public health, but he'd never seen anything like this before. And at the same time, Taylor also realized that as alarming as this was, very few other people, if anybody, would see this as a problem. He was like the one person in the world that had the expertise to see how catastrophic this might actually be. And so desperate to warn others, he wound up posting a very urgent announcement on this weather website that he managed, but unfortunately, it just wasn't seen by enough people in time. And so now, as hospitals all across Melbourne overflowed with people gasping for air, Taylor sat in his backyard watching the storm unfold. The sky was pitch black, rain and hail was coming down, the wind was whipping, and off in the distance, all he could hear was thunder and sirens. And he knew, unfortunately, his prediction had been right. Just like Professor Taylor's weather models had predicted, on November 21st, 2016, Melbourne, Australia was hit by an extremely rare event known as thunderstorm asthma. This deadly phenomenon can only occur when three very specific weather conditions align. 1, high heat during the day, 2, a very powerful thunderstorm, and 3, extremely high pollen levels. Melbourne's heat that day had caused unusually high concentrations of ryegrass pollen to hang in the air. And then when that huge thunderstorm rolled in, the intense humidity, the wind, and the rain shattered the pollen grains into microscopic fragments. And then these tiny particles, which were way smaller than regular pollen, were carried by this storm deep into people's homes and into their lungs. Unlike normal pollen, these microscopic fragments bypassed the body's typical defenses and embedded themselves deep into people's lungs, causing severe and sudden asthma attacks. Now, for people who already had asthma, this was catastrophic. But even perfectly healthy people found themselves gasping for air, overwhelmed by the sheer density of this microscopic pollen. The storm had essentially made the air everybody in Melbourne was breathing deadly. As for Jody Santoro, she would spend days in the ICU, hooked up to monitors, with machines pumping oxygen into her lungs while her body fought to heal. But she was lucky. She would eventually recover. And in the days that followed, she would learn the full scale of what actually happened in Melbourne. Nearly 10,000 people had flooded the hospitals across Australia, complaining of the same symptoms that Jody did. And unfortunately, of those 10,000, 10 people actually lost their lives, and many of them were totally healthy and had never had an asthma attack in their lives before. For Jody, despite surviving this ordeal, the awful memory of what happened on that night will forever be on her mind. She is now all too aware of how fragile life can be and how quickly things can change. The next and final story is called All in Their Heads. On a sunny afternoon in the summer of 1953, a young woman named An stood in the middle of a huge sugarcane grove in an isolated forest in Papua New Guinea. And around her were all her relatives and neighbors, and they were all there to mourn the loss of An's sister, whose name was Ton. She had passed away 3 days earlier from a very mysterious illness that people in An's village called Kuru. And in their language, the word Kuru meant trembling. Now, keep in mind, this particular mystery illness that was called Kuru only affected the people in An and Tan's village. This is like a hyper-specific illness that only happened inside of this little forest to these people. But An and the rest of the people in her village had seen this happen over and over and over again every year, and so they knew what happened when you got Kuru because it was always the same. As soon as you began to tremble, that was kind of like the first sign, 1 year or so after that moment, you lose control of all the muscles in your body until you die. And so in Tan's case, so An's sister, she had watched this happen exactly as it did for everybody else that ever got this illness. She started with the tremors, and then before long she couldn't even stand up or walk around, and then finally her sister lost control of the muscles in her throat, and so she couldn't eat despite being hungry, and so ultimately she died of starvation, which is like one of the worst ways to die. It's incredibly slow and very, very painful. And so ever since Tan's death 3 days earlier, the village had been performing all these rituals and prayers in an attempt to assist Tan's spirit on its way into the afterlife. And this type of very involved funeral was absolutely customary in An's culture. An and her family and all of these villagers were members of the Foray people, who were native to Papua New Guinea, which is an island just north of Australia. And in 1953, when this story is taking place, the Foray people numbered about 11,000 people. And remember, they live in a very isolated forest. They are basically cut off from the world for the most part. But they were beginning to fear that they were going to go extinct because of Kuru. Every year, the Foray people lost 200 people to Kuru. And for the most part, the victims were women, like disproportionately so, which made it even more likely that the Foray people would go extinct, because if you lose all the women, you can't have any more kids. And in fact, by 1953, so many women had died from Kuru that by this point, there were 3 times as many men as there were women. In fact, the leading cause of death for Foray women was Kuru. But the Foray people did not view Kuru as just an illness. They actually viewed it as a curse. In fact, that was completely accepted that that is exactly what it was. This is not like getting the cold. Somebody did this to you. Like a sorcerer somewhere, some unnamed sorcerer that's like coming into the forest is targeting these women and cursing them with Kuru. And so the Foray people put on these really elaborate funerals, mostly to ward off these dark magic sorcerers that were casting Kuru spells. And so the Foray people believed that if they just nailed the funeral procedure for somebody who has just died from Kuru, the kind of 3-day long, all these rituals and prayers they have to do, if the village is able to nail it perfectly, then the deceased who's passed away from Kuru, so in this case, An's sister Tan, her spirit, as a result of this perfect funeral, would be able to kind of rise up and actually seek revenge on the sorcerer who killed the person. And so these funerals were basically like kind of taking the dead, rising their spirit, and sending them off to go kill the sorcerer. And so An and the rest of her villagers, they went through this very elaborate process for An's sister, Tan, and at the end of it, they did feel like they had really nailed it. And so they felt confident that Tan's spirit was going to rise up and get her revenge. A few weeks after An's sister's funeral, An was standing over an open fire, and she was cooking some pork and sweet potatoes, and as she went to flip the meat over, she reached her hand out, and she noticed her hand was trembling, which is the first sign of someone with Kuru. Now, An told herself that, oh no, I don't have Kuru, it's just because I was working really hard today and I'm tired, like that's all it is. But she knew deep down, she may have been cursed. An did her best to kind of hide her trembling hands. However, after about a month from that first time she noticed her hands shaking, she noticed she wasn't really able to stand up without kind of losing her balance because her legs were starting to tremble. And finally, when she basically couldn't even stand up without assistance, this is again only 1 month after that first tremble, she knew she had Kuru. And An already knew that there was absolutely nothing anybody in her village could do to stop this from killing her. Kuru was a 100% death sentence. And so if you got Kuru, it's like the whole village just began prepping for your death because they had to be ready to do this big ritualistic funeral. And so imagine that. You have this mystery illness or curse or whatever you want to think it is, and you're just counting down the days until you die. But for An, even though she had seen this happen so many times before and just kind of knew there's nothing she could do, she couldn't stand the idea of having this horrible, slow, painful death. And so she decided, you know what? I'm going to do something drastic that basically nobody else had done before who had Kuru. So for context, at this time, the Foray people had been totally isolated from other people in the world for thousands of years. They basically lived in this little part of Papua New Guinea in the forest, and nobody else contacted them. They were totally isolated. However, starting in the 1950s, some Australian colonists and researchers and police actually began kind of making their way in and around the Foray people's area. So they were making contact, albeit not necessarily direct contact, but the Foray people were seeing basically white people wandering around in and around their forest from time to time. And it was always very shocking when they would see these people because they dressed completely differently, they looked totally different. I mean, it's like two worlds totally colliding. And generally speaking, An and the rest of the people in her village, they did not like having these Australian people kind of wandering around. But An is thinking, you know, the people in my village, the Foray people, they have no solutions for me. So maybe these Australian people that have kind of popped up, maybe they have some answers about what I can do to stop myself from dying from this horrible curse. Keep in mind, by going out and seeking help from these outsiders, it was like An would be breaking a huge custom. This is so taboo for the Foray people, and very likely, even if she was able to find a solution from these outsiders, it's not clear if she would have been welcomed back into her village. And so this is a truly desperate measure she's taking, but she really felt like she had no choice. So, even as her body trembled from Kuru, An managed to stand up using a stick, and she began kind of hobbling her way quietly and discreetly out of her village, something that she really never did. And eventually, after hobbling her way out of sight of the Foray people, she began making her way through the woods, and she eventually came to a clearing where there was this house. And it was obvious this is not a house that the Foray people have built. This is somebody from the outside who's built something kind of near where they were living. And so An wandered up to this house, not really sure what to do, but she went up and knocked on the door. And a second later, it opened up. And it's this Australian anthropologist named Ronald Burnt, who actually An had seen before. He had been coming through her village a couple of times, attempting to interview people to learn more about the Foray people. She knew that nobody wanted to talk to him, but, you know, she had seen him before. And so she was relieved. This is someone that I'm somewhat familiar with. And so as Ronald is staring back at her, and Ronald's pretty tall and skinny, he's got glasses on, he's dressed like a typical Australian in the 1950s, and he's looking at An, and An begins to try to tell him what's going on with her. And as she began to talk, the words she was saying were coming out all garbled, and she realized that the Kuru curse was now affecting her throat, the muscles in her neck, and she was not able to speak. But as it happened, Ronald, who was very familiar with the Foray people, he could tell, based on just the way she was acting and how desperate she looked, that very likely this woman was here because she believed she had Kuru. And Ronald, who had learned about Kuru after studying the Foray people, he had done some research on it, and he believed it was entirely psychosomatic, that this was not an actual illness. Basically, he believed Kuru was acute hysteria, that these Foray people were just going crazy and convincing themselves that they had this illness, and I guess that kind of manifested their death a year later. And so Ronald interrupted An, who again is struggling to talk, and he was able to communicate to her in her language that you do not have Kuru, you are hysterical, this is in your head, and you should go now. And then he shut the door on her. And An had no idea what to do. She was embarrassed. She was terrified that maybe somebody from her village had seen her come out here. And so just trembling and feeling so alone and so scared, she turned around and just went back to her village. Nine months later, An's condition had severely deteriorated. She basically was following exactly the process of every other person she had seen with Kuru. She had lost virtually all the control of her body. She could barely sip water. She was feeling absolutely horrible. I mean, she knew she was closing in on death, and she had not gone back out to try to get help from outsiders. That interaction with Ronald had kind of destroyed her hope, and so she did go back and just was kind of waiting to die, just like everybody else in her village did. But for An, the physical symptoms of Kuru that she was experiencing were undoubtedly terrible. but they were not as bad, at least to An, as the other side of Kuru. So in addition to referring to this curse as Kuru, which meant trembling, sometimes Foray people would refer to this curse, this illness, as the laughing death. And it's because during the terminal stage, so the end stage of Kuru, when you're just about to die, you just begin laughing. It doesn't matter what you're thinking about. This is not an actual laugh. You're not thinking something's funny. It's like you could be weeping and totally depressed because you know you're going to die, but you keep hysterically laughing, which makes your whole body sore from constantly laughing over and over again. And An was beginning to experience that. She would be weeping and laughing at the same time. And think about this, everybody else who's in the village, they know what this means. And so their preparations for her death are only getting more and more ramped up. They're getting ready for the big ritualistic funeral they're going to give to An. And so An, as she's hysterically laughing, is fully aware that everybody's just waiting for her to die. And finally, just a few weeks after she had begun the laughing side of Kuru, An would pass away, almost exactly 1 year from when she first noticed the trembling in her hand when she was cooking over that fire. After An's death, more and more people just kept on getting Kuru. And over the next 7 years, it was like clockwork. 200 plus Foray people died from Kuru every year, and nobody had any idea how to stop it. It just became a part of their lives, and again, they kept getting closer and closer to being extinct. It was this really terrifying time. Seven years after An's death, so in 1961, a medical anthropologist named Shirley Lindenbaum was sitting in her office at City University in New York reading over old scientific articles. And as she was just kind of flipping through them, she noticed there was an article from an Australian anthropologist named Ronald Berndt, the same guy who had turned An away and told her, no, you don't have Kuru, that's not real, it's psychosomatic. And in this article, Ronald outlined these symptoms that the Foray people were exhibiting that obviously were not real. They had tremors, loss of muscle control, and huge mood swings. But Ronald was like, it's all in their head. It's not a real disease. But to Shirley, as she's reading this, she's thinking, why has Ronald decided this has to be psychosomatic? These symptoms seem like a real disease, like a neurological condition. Something must be attacking their brains, causing them to have these symptoms and then die. But when Shirley, just out of curiosity, began to do some additional research on the Kuru disease, or whatever you want to call it, she discovered that there was basically no real research other than Ronald's about this weird illness. And so she decided, you know what, there's a gap in the research, and I'm going to fill it. I'm going to figure out what's going on with the Foray people and this weird thing called Kuru. So the following summer, when Shirley finally had some time, she left New York and flew to Papua New Guinea, and she made her way into the forest to contact the Foray people. And eventually she reached some of these small villages that contained Foray people, and the Foray people, even if they didn't necessarily embrace Shirley, many of them were open to at least speaking to her and talking about their culture, their customs, their history, and of course talking about Kuru, this curse. And eventually Shirley made her way into this one particular Foray village where she actually saw a white man just walking around in this village, so he really stood out. And so immediately Shirley walked up to this guy, and he introduced himself as Dr. Michael Alpers, and he told Shirley he had been living in these villages with the Foray people for several months because he was studying Kuru. He wanted to figure out, what's actually causing it, because he also felt very skeptical at the idea that this is just psychosomatic. That did not seem very plausible. And so Shirley and Dr. Alpers were totally aligned, and they're like, hey, let's swap notes and do this together. And so Shirley began telling Dr. Alpers about what she had learned so far, and she said that when she showed up in Papua New Guinea, she believed what Kuru was a genetic brain disease, meaning it would be passed down from, parent to child and so on and so forth. But she quickly discovered that after conducting research and talking to the Foray people in these villages, that was not the case. This was not something that went from parent to child. Instead, Kuru appeared to spread amongst tight-knit social groups within these villages, which seemed to indicate this was actually a contagious disease, not a genetic one. And so she told Dr. Alpers that now her working theory was that Kuru was actually a contagious type of encephalitis, which is inflammation of the brain. But Shirley also said to Dr. Alpers that that did not explain why so many victims of Kuru were female. And Shirley also said to Dr. Alpers that, I've been around loads of people with Kuru, and I don't have it, so how can it be contagious? Dr. Alpers agreed with everything Shirley was saying, and in fact had come to a similar conclusion himself, which meant he also had the same questions. Why only women, and why wasn't he getting it? But he told Shirley that when he began trying to answer this question, he discovered that actually, in addition to lots of women getting Kuru, also lots of kids got Kuru. Not necessarily parent to child, but also children in these villages seemed to be slightly more susceptible to getting Kuru than men. And in fact, Dr. Alpers told Shirley that right now there was a 12-year-old boy who was in the final stage of Kuru, so the laughing stage, the terminal stage, and because this boy's parents knew their son was going to die, they were so desperate and grief-stricken that when Dr. Alpers came by and offered to do an autopsy on their son when he passed to try to learn more, the parents agreed, even though that meant totally breaking 4A custom. So this was like major taboo decision. But again, the 4A people are getting more and more desperate as they go closer and closer to the brink of extinction from Kuru. A few days later, Dr. Alpers found Shirley, and he told her that the 12-year-old boy had passed away, and so now it was time to conduct the autopsy. And so he led Shirley to a clearing in the woods that was kind of far away from the eyes of the villagers, and there was a makeshift autopsy table with this boy's body on it. And while Shirley really could not stand to watch this actually happen, she did go over after Dr. Alpers had opened up the boy's skull, revealing his brain. And he yelled to her, "Hey, you have to come over here and look at this." And so Shirley walked over and she looked down, and even though she had not seen a human brain before right in front of her, she knew right away there's something terribly wrong with that brain. His brain was completely shriveled up and covered in holes, as if like a worm had drilled through his brain. And so Shirley and Dr. Alpers immediately knew this brain has to be sent off for further testing because something's happening here that's not psychosomatic. This is a real disease that is killing these people. About a year later, Shirley was back home in New York in her office when she received a letter from a research team at the United States National Institutes of Health, or NIH for short. And the NIH is one of the largest medical research facilities in the world. And it was where Shirley and Dr. Alpers had sent off that boy's brain for further study. And so by getting this letter, Shirley knew she was going to get information about whatever they discovered in this boy's brain. And so she ripped it open and pulled out the report and began reading. And the researchers said they had spent the last year, studying this brain tissue, and while they still didn't really understand how Kuru even happened and what caused it, was it a virus or an infection, they didn't know, but they had discovered something about how Kuru spread. During one of their experiments, the NIH researchers had injected some tissue from this boy's brain into a chimpanzee, and very quickly, that chimpanzee developed Kuru. And so this told the researchers that yes, Kuru was contagious, and it spread through infected brain tissue. But how one person's infected brain got into another person's brain was the big mystery. But at least they had found something. But as Shirley read this, because she had done all that research when she went into the forests of Papua New Guinea and spoke to all these 4A people, she had learned a lot about what they did on a day-to-day basis and, what their various customs and rituals were. And she actually knew exactly how something like this could happen, something that only the 4A people were doing. During her research in Papua New Guinea, Shirley had learned that 4A people believe all humans have 5 distinct souls. There was that one soul that 4A people believed they could basically summon up out of a deceased person that would then go avenge that person's death. So think about how all those people who died from Kuru, they believed that was a curse from some sorcerer. And so a big part of that funeral process was to call out that soul to go avenge their death, go find the sorcerer and kill them. But that was just one soul. There were 4 others. And of these 4 others, there was one called the Quila, which was the most dangerous. Quila meant flesh in the 4A people's language, and this soul was like a manifestation of death and decay, because that's what our flesh does. It just kind of gradually dies all the time. And so they looked at the flesh as being a really bad thing. And so they believed after someone died, their flesh needed to be stored properly. Otherwise, it would pollute the air and cause more death and decay for other people that were still alive. And the safest place, according to the 4A people, for the quila to be stored, so human flesh, was inside of a woman's body. And the reason for this is 4A people believe women's bodies are much more resilient than men's, and so if anybody could withstand holding quila inside of them, it would be the women. But there was a very specific process that the 4A women had to follow in order to kind of put this quila inside of themselves. And multiple 4A women had explained this totally bizarre process to Shirley when she was out there talking to the people in the village. The way it worked is a few days after a 4A member has passed away, this huge feast is prepared. Except the feast only consists of the quila. Basically, the person who is dead is chopped up and prepared by the women, like their entire body gets consumed. Now, keep in mind, anybody hearing about this who's not a member of the 4A people would be like, oh my god, that's horrible. But to 4A people, this ritualistic cannibalism was actually an act of love. The idea was, by having these women consume the quila, consuming the dead person, you're protecting the living because you don't want the quila out and about polluting the air, and you are respecting the dead. But remember, Kuru got spread through infected brain tissue. And it just so happened that during these funeral feasts, when they were consuming the quila, the brain of the deceased person was an absolute delicacy. And so the brain was reserved for close female relatives of the deceased person. And so during An's sister's funeral, so when Ton passed, what do you think An ate? She ate Ton's brain. And then also, critically, Shirley had learned that a lot of these women who were given the brain, this delicacy during these funerals, they would often sneak little pieces of the brain and hand it out to kids as like a little treat. They would take the brain and eat it. Nobody knew. That's why the kids were also getting Kuru. And so a few years after this incredible discovery by Shirley about how Kuru was being passed along, the Australian colonial government banned the practice of ritualistic cannibalism in Papua New Guinea. Basically, they were telling the 4A people to stop eating the dead. It's what's killing you. And the 4A people, who were very desperate to stop being killed by Kuru, they took to it, stopped eating each other, and so Kuru was virtually eradicated, and the 4A population, instead of sliding towards extinction, actually began to grow really fast. And today, the total population has at least doubled. And also, just to close this out, one final note is it took until 1990 to actually figure out what was going on inside of these people's bodies when they had Kuru. Because back in the 60s, when they figured out how not to get Kuru, nobody understood what was even happening. It was just like, don't eat other people and you'll be okay, but that's all they knew. And while the process in the human body that caused Kuru remained a mystery for many decades after Shirley's big discovery, in the 1990s, researchers did finally figure out what's actually going on. Basically, somebody with Kuru has these proteins in their brain called prions that fold wrong into the wrong shape and then cannot function properly. This loss of protein function rapidly kills brain cells, which in turn shrivels up the brain and causes all those holes all over it.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.
The Mr. Ballin podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballin. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden.